And you are here to tell us about your experience at the Peace Camp. Starting with whatever your first
How'd you hear
memories
about
are.
it?
Yeah.
I heard about it on television, and I had a dear friend who was in England at the time, and she had been having these horrible dreams about nuclear war, and she was really, really concerned about the situation. And suddenly there was this camp that was happening that was to stop the deployment of the cruise and Pershing missiles. And I thought, Beryl's not here to do it. Nothing like codependency. Like, well, I have to go there for her. And so I went. I was in fact ready to go on a little backpacking vacation. And so I had all my gear in the car, and I ended up going to Romulus, New York. And I never quite left. Well, I stayed for for my whole vacation time. And I knew nothing about nuclear weapons other than of their existence, and that I didn't. Eventually I came, within a very short period of time, a couple of hours probably, that I realized that that I needed to do something so that if things did blow, my grandchildren wouldn't be asking me why hadn't I done something about it. And so I stayed and learned more about nuclear weapons, and eventually began to understand the connections between violence and the weapons just being the ultimate violence, but all the abuse and violence of women, in a way, being very connected to weapons and war and the patriarchy, and started on a whole new life, in a way, of coming out as a lesbian. Just felt like I had come home. The tables are turned. I love it. I'm the
I've never
interviewer.
done that.
So, Estelle,
anything else?
what happened then?
Like, we could say, you guys have just been talking up a storm all day.
Okay.
You just act like you're talking to her. It's very conversational.
Okay.
So it's like,
So what are your like in 1983? You were there for the opening.
I got there
When did you-
July 5th. I was
Okay.
not there opening day.
Okay. And so how was it for you when you got there? What was it like?
It was a little strange.
Yeah.
I wasn't sure exactly what to do, whether I belonged there. There were little kids running around with mud all over them and barefoot, and I thought, oh, this is a little far out. And women were doing circles, and I wasn't sure what the rules were, and I remember going, well, you can, if you don't like it, you can step away. But being, somewhat unsure, but then almost immediately in that first circle, feeling the loving energy of the women anointing each other with oil and just exchanging energy around the circle I was hooked.
Do you remember what that circle was about?
No.
Okay.
Had you been around women in a large group like that before?
Not at all. Not at all. I had no connection to any women's groups of any kind, other than that I had done daycare in Roxbury, Mass, and had a group of women that we had written a proposal and had done this daycare a number of years before, but we never were part of the feminist movement in any like connected way. We knew that there were women's centers, but we really didn't have time to be connected to anything that was outside of the problems that we were having right where we were living, bringing up all of our children and getting funded by the welfare department to do daycare so that women could go to work, because it was a big push to get women off welfare and into jobs. But the truth was that there wasn't daycare. So anyhow, I mean, we were very, very involved in trying to make that happen. And you know, we didn't have any money. We just had a lot of kids. And so when I got to the peace camp, though, I began to realize that we had within our own little group discovered lots of the same ideals and had read many of the same books. Like, it amazed me. What? There was a reading list of women's books? There are women's books? You know, and I think in that list, like, A Woman's Room and I thought that, I remember reading that book, and I felt like that was my story. Somebody had written, you know, a book about my life. I so identified with that book at the time. And so it amazed me that out of this long list that I had read so many of those books. And how that happened, I have no idea, because I didn't know that there were.
The list was at the peace camp?
There was a list at the peace camp, a list of reading material of women's books. Isn't it? Now, I remember that. I hope maybe I dreamt it.
Well, no matter. So when you got there, you had were you in a tent? You camped in a tent there?
Yep, I had my backpacking tent. I set up in Amazon Acres. My neighbor was Murph, who was doing media, and then some women from Vermont and some from New Hampshire. So I think those 4 tents in a row. I remember. Not distinctly, you know, I just remember that's where the women in each of those tents was from. And I didn't quite know how to immediately, like, how to fit in. You know, so I would, like, just kind of tried to see what needed to be done, but I did not know how to exactly how to what one was supposed to do. But it didn't take very long to.
What did you find out? I mean, what did you eventually feel like you were supposed to be doing?
I think having been, there are things that come with you. Having been a mother of 6 children, I noticed that I was always like one of the last people to go to bed at night. That, you know, it's like kind of sitting around the fire until pretty much everybody else has gone to bed. And also first thing in the morning, being up before most people were up. And I remember running into the garden at one point and saying something like, so I guess I'm looking for something to do. And the garden saying, well, I suppose you could pick up cigarette butts, which were, you know, there were a lot of smokers at that time, and people were not necessarily good about, you know, stripping cigarettes and stuff. I remember it's very vague about the very first year, although it did not take long for me to become totally involved. And I remember by the time the Minnesota buses arrived, that we had gone around to the truck gate, and at the truck gate I overheard the sheriff talking to somebody, because there was a woman from Minnesota who had a baby with her. And anyhow, the Minnesota women were all there, and this woman with this baby, and I heard the sheriff tell somebody how let's call social services and get these women and get these children taken away from these women. Kind of, that was his attitude, was, you know, like, let's punish these women for if they involve any child in the action. And I remember hightailing it back to the camp and saying, hey, look, here's something that we really need to do something about. And somebody saying, okay, so do it. And, like, you know, so then ending up, you know, having to call social services and find out what the rules were and what could we do about it. And I remember making up a release for women who didn't want to bring their children into, who wanted to do an action but they needed to have a responsible person who was going to look after their child. And ending up being that person. Like,
You ended up being that person?
yeah. You know, somebody's got to be the responsible person for these children. So, I mean, and then I got involved in the authorities' meetings. That the authorities involved, you know, the sheriff's department and the troopers from the park service rangers, I think, because we were going to have a lot of people camping there for the August action. And a number of people, and I remember there was an older guy who really was treating the women very, very well. And when an officer spoke something kind of out of turn, like, he immediately said to him, gave him a little speech on respecting the women, and that I was, you know, I thought, oh, he's a good guy.
Was this man from the town, or he was?
I think he was with the Waterloo Sheriff's Department.
Oh.
And he then did have officers trained to deal with the women in a respectful manner. I mean, they really did make an effort. And I kind of stayed involved with the authorities stuff for quite a while, like over the years, over many years.
Yeah, you had good relations with the sheriff, and
Yeah, especially with Jeff Bond, who later became the sheriff. You know, I can't remember the names or the orders, but I do remember that some of those authorities meetings involved some of the folks, I think, security at the depot. In later years, initially they had military police, but later on they brought in a civilians who did security. And I remember that during actions there were numbers of times when we would, the sheriff, myself, and then Tony from inside would be standing at the gate talking while the women are like doing an action, maybe even going over the fence. It's kind of like we're talking about, okay, so how's your wife, and you know, how was your vacation, and so on, you know, like
while the action was happening?
Even while an action was going on, because but a big part of what we would do is we would have these meetings where for the police and for the security, it was like to try to get some kind of an estimate of how many women were going to be there.
So they would talk to you?
And oh yes, but But my idea of having authorities meetings was to invite all the women who were at the encampment. Anybody want to go to an authorities
Yeah.
meeting? You know, we're going to go talk about what might happen here this summer. Well, nobody knows what's going to happen here this summer, so let's go find out what they think is going to happen. And that's kind of, I mean, some of the meetings were at McCastro's.
Yeah,
You know.
Castro's.
Let's go have lunch.
And so this was later, this wasn't in 83, this
Not
was...
in '83, no.
A couple years.
It started, but it did start in '83. The first authorities meeting that I went to was in '83. But it did start and set up a whole, I guess maybe a niche or something that I then stayed involved with.
Yeah, yeah.
'83, after Waterloo, I remember, you know, going over to the high school at Interlaken on a very, in fact, the women who had been arrested had been put into a school in Interlaken. In, I guess, the gymnasium part of the school had been set up as a prison. And there were police outside. There was a line of police, and then there were the women from the encampment. And so I decided that I was going to go and check on that every day, and also go check on. There were women at the main gate who were doing an action. They were actually staying at that gate sometimes overnight. They had boxes and they turned into these little houses. There were people at the truck gate. So that meant there was the Peace Camp, main gate, Interlaken, and the truck gate. And so I started and there were also supporters at each of these places. So it was so fix food, bring water, and I had this little go round that I would do, you know, and go visit with these women and find out what's going on here and carry news around from the Peace Camp to Interlaken, you know, to the main gate, to Interlaken, to the truck gate, and whatever news they had got passed on to the other.
Did you usually go by yourself doing that?
I did. For a while I was going by myself, but then there were other women who were interested in doing it, and so I started having, you know, people go along, and it was kind of fun.
Yeah. Were the actions and the women sleeping overnight at the gates in support of the women in Interlaken? Or
Women
separate?
had different affinity groups were doing different things.
Uh-huh.
And so I no longer, I remember that Cassie was at the front gate. I remember some very funny things, like wear a skirt because it's easy to squat. You know, if you have to be in full view, you can still squat and take a pee. So I don't remember whether those actions were coordinated with the women in Interlaken. I just don't remember that part. I just remember there were different things going on. And also, it's a long time ago. There's a lot of years, a lot of actions in it. I think that maybe a lot of stuff is blends and is merged, you know.
Do you want to talk a little more about being a support person for the women at Interlaken? And what sort of things happened?
Well, you know, for the most, I remember that a lot of it was very fun. I would kind of negotiate with the cops. Hey, listen, I need another few feet so the women inside can really hear me, and I'll bring you some brownies tomorrow if you let me get closer. And those kinds of things, and you know, a lot of the play of calling, singing songs, call and response kinds of things back and forth, trying to get messages into the school without revealing stuff.
And
reading the newspapers, just funny stuff. But later on, we had gathered there one day, and there were a number of women decided that they would stay overnight, that they were going to sleep there. And townspeople had gathered. And at some point, a local woman decided that she would run us back to the camp, Jane Eyre and myself, if we, because people needed sleeping bags and things to be able to stay overnight. So we got all the instructions about where stuff was, what people wanted, and we went back to the camp. And that was like kind of a twilight time. It was, starting, by the time we got back there, it was starting to get dark. And suddenly the number of people had escalated. There might have been, a couple of hundred even, people who were now in the parking lot, and the women were kind of up on the grassy area on the little knoll. And Jane and I got out of the car. We could see that something was up, but all of a sudden I was aware that there had been a guy there that I'd seen earlier who had been drinking and was not terribly pleasant that afternoon, coming at me, and he came at me and he punched me in the breast, and I had a knapsack on with bunches of stuff for the women, and I remember going down on my knees, and I got up and I got punched again. The third time I got punched was by a different person. But anyhow, and there was a cop standing right there who kind of like, well, I can't help you under these circumstances. And then I was like absolutely determined then that I was going to get to the women. And I couldn't get through the crowd. And so then I went through, there were cars that were parked fairly close. It seems to me it was a fence, or there was something there. And I went to the other side of the cars. The cars were facing in. And when I did that, as I would pass between two cars, there'd be flags, the pointed ends of flags would be like poking in, and I thought, I'm gonna lose my eye to the American flag, which just seemed like this really strange thing. And then at the point where suddenly the crowd decided they were gonna stop me from getting through the cars, it was like gonna be blockaded, I saw this hand come through. And somebody's hand came through, and I just grabbed that hand and got pulled through the number of townspeople there who were now going to block the way, and got pulled on up the hill, and now I was with the women. And it was years before I found out whose hand had pulled me through, and it was Becky, from Greenham Common. And eventually I linked up with Jane Eyre. Now Jane Eyre had just gone around the other side of the crowd, and nothing had happened to her. But while I was being punched out, I remember hearing one of the women video collective tell me that she was recording. She didn't have a camera, but she was recording what was going on. And that was Janice Melton, was a woman that I had worked with years and years before in Roxbury, Mass. Yeah, so that was funny little things happened. So anyhow, that.
Do you remember any of what the townspeople were saying, or what it was they were trying to stop you from doing, or what?
At this point, I don't. I don't. They didn't want us there. Somehow they saw us as, that we were commie dykes, and they didn't want wives and daughters anywhere near us. So, but I don't remember distinctly what their, I remember being just amazed at the amount of people, how much the numbers had escalated of townspeople. And that they had, somehow they had sent in more cops, but it certainly wasn't to protect us. But then the women got very definite about they were not going to move, or that they were sitting down, and that we were going to do go-rounds until we didn't feel we could get up and walk away. That the crowd was just in a really nasty mood. And I do remember that there were a number of cops who, the women just, the cops said we had to move, and the women said we're not going anywhere until we get this worked out amongst us. And how the cops then began to give us the time we needed to process for women to make the decisions about what they were going to do. And eventually, most of us did leave. Some women did stay overnight and were arrested. I'm not exactly sure how, when, this must have been just before the big action on August 1st, but I can't remember how many days ahead of it, or, whether this was 2 days before or the night before. I no longer have any time frame. I just don't remember much.
Remember a lot.
Yeah, it sounds like you remember a lot. Does anything in particular stand out from the first year that you were there in regards to doing actions or supporting women that were doing actions?
Well, women were coming from all over, and different women were doing different little things. And by now I'd gotten really serious about not wanting my grandchildren to be asking me this question about. And so I bought all these bells, and I had this green twine, and I remember I had a little poem that I would go around and put bells on women's wrists, and it was like, this bell rings on a green thread of hope, that none of the children sleeping in the night will ever awaken to death by a blinding flash of light. And I would just, do this to all the women. I think it was my way of connecting with individual women, and of I guess of being a part. I wasn't able to go over the fence because I was working a job, and although I could be there 3 or 4 days in a row, because sometimes I worked everybody's vacation time, so I would have 4 days off, 3 days on, 4 days off, or vice versa. And so I got to be there a lot, but I couldn't get arrested and I couldn't go to jail. So it gave me, in a way to make eye contact and kind of a direct contact with individual women. And I remember we were going to do an action in the Q zone. Women had these big puppets, and that was the first time that I ever did the bell thing. And so there was quite a large circle, and I think I went to every woman in the circle. And that on the way out, that Jeff Bond was in one of the police cars, and I belled the police as well. And he told me later on, number one, that had been a pretty traumatic summer for him, because his wedding almost didn't come off because he had to work so much overtime, and anyhow it almost blew away his wedding. And he said, but I want you to know that little bell on that green string is still hanging on my dresser mirror.
Really?
Yeah, this was like years later. And by then we had become, there were times when, we really needed to, we did not like calling the police in under any circumstances. If we could handle it ourselves, we were going to. But early on, the first summer, there were things like women being let out. Oh, this is great. Great outfit, don't you
Thank you, Hershey.
Thanks. Yeah, I have my own personal dresser. Okay, so I was talking about, that women would go and do an action, and they would be detained at the depot, but then there were all these different gates, and women were being let out at gates on the back side of the depot on streets that had no lights. This is a very rural area, and at one point, some locals, or maybe some guys off the base, would swerve, and kind of women had to fall into the ditch to get out of the way of the cars. And once the police were onto that, they became very, very supportive of, we cannot have anything happen to any of the women at the encampment. And that was another one of the things of, like the meeting with the authorities. It was like they wanted to maintain safety for the women, and eventually got it so that the depot was only, would call us at the encampment so that we could go up and meet the women. And they would have to tell us what gate they were going to let them out. And we would, send cars up. And I did a lot of that somehow, going up and meeting the women and belling the women as they came out from doing actions, if they hadn't been belled. I don't know.
Do you remember where you even came up with the idea of the bell? What it represents?
I'm sure I'd been hanging out with Barbara Greenham, and she had this dirge that we did at the main gate a couple of times, and the blinding flash of light is in that dirge, and that I think that's part of that suddenly and I think also that the media had. I'm not good with media or interviews or whatever, and I didn't really, but I got caught in one of those times when, media's got a mic in front of you and like, why are you here? And the thing about my grandchildren, and then that just became the thing, I did not want that to happen. And also I was extremely naive at the time. When I first heard the TV announcement about the encampment, and they were talking about there were going to be women from all over the world, I honestly thought the most brilliant women in the world are going to be there, and they're going to have the answers. And I'm going to go there, and listen, as if, great truth will be revealed and we'll know how to handle things. And there were brilliant women from all over the world. But the problem was not resolved. And so, so then suddenly it's like, you have to be part of the solution. And I think my growth into I didn't know how to resolve the solution, but I could put little bells on and let people know what I was feeling or thinking, or what I wanted for the future was certainly not to ever have to face this.
I think I kept my bell for years, Estelle, and every time I've referred to you over the years, it's Estelle with the bells.
Yeah.
So that was really profound.
Yeah, a lot of, and then there were women who came to me and, you know, who knows why, but they thought that I had like, what is the word? Like ignored or passed over them because they didn't have a bell. And I just felt so horrible, you know, it was like, because there's no way of remembering. I mean, I did hundreds of those bells, hundreds and hundreds of them. And then I remember Lindsay at one point had a bell and said something to me, and I was like horrified, you know, like some
Created a
people
monster.
who'd been there for a long, you know, over time had not received a bell. But you know,
Can you talk about, like, did your family or friends, did they have any reaction to what your sudden new pastime was?
my family was quite supportive, actually. It was very funny to sit. I had 2 sons who were in the National Guard, and I remember that the 3 of us were sitting there all doing our boots, and they were doing their boots, and so I would ask them, like, so why are you doing your boots that way? Oh, you know, you had to have like spit polish shine, and Mark's commander or whoever, you know, like required this, and Matthews, you know, he was a little more lackadaisical, and I was going, I do mine to keep them dry. But just having these discussions, you know, about our boots, sitting there, the 3 of us doing our boots together, and them being in the military, but being totally supportive of what I was doing. Yeah, my family was quite supportive, actually.
And were there friends from Rochester that came with you eventually to the camp, or was it really just the thing that you did?
Well, eventually Beryl came back from England, and she was the love of my life, and now I really wanted her to share this wonderful experience that I was having. And she came to the camp, and it was really wonderful for like 2 days. But I think the 3rd day she suddenly realized that to come out as a lesbian meant she was going to have to, that she would be ostracized by society. And that was really hard, because I felt like I had come home, and she felt like that she was in a dangerous situation and she couldn't make the break. And so eventually the love of my life, you know, just wasn't a part of it. That was over a number of years. I mean, anyhow, love at the peace camp. My.
What, you said you came out at the camp. When did that happen? How did that happen?
Oh, about, how did that happen? I don't know, but it came, it was on, it was recorded for posterity, because it was during an interview, I think, that I came out.
An interview with the press?
Probably with the Women's Video Collective.
What happened? Tell us.
You know what? I don't remember. I just really
They were
don't
just
remember.
interviewing you, and
But I do remember coming out. I remember that I came out as a lesbian, and very shortly afterwards came out as a witch. Yeah. With Dr. Deming, with the newspapers, like probably the Finger Lakes Times or something. And both of us saying that we're not, there was somebody who wanted to find out about the witches or something, and I was like asking people, you know, to come and do an interview about witches, and I wasn't getting very many answers, and Barbara Deming was sitting in a group, and she said, I'll do it with you. And then as we're walking over, we're going, okay, now we won't say that we're witches. And then the first thing out of when we started talking, you know, was probably, or shortly after starting to talk, out it came.
And can you talk about that a little bit? What that was like, discovering you're a witch, or you know, being?
No, I had
a witch?
always known I was a witch from the time I was a child. But finding the other witches, now that was magnificent. All my life I'd always had to do all my little stuff, and I never, as a small child, it was like there was this knowledge of being a witch, and I had my little magic marble, little ruby red. It was a small marble, smaller than the Chinese checkers that everybody had marbles. This was not like any other marble. And I just felt that it was my special, magical. And I was brought up Catholic, and knowing, I knew I was a witch, but I didn't really understand very much about it, except that was so. And I used to go to church, and I used to go to the baby Jesus and say, baby Jesus, there must be good witches, because I'm one. And it was like my little prayer to the baby Jesus. I mean, I was probably doing that like kindergarten, first grade, and you know, I'd stop by the church on my way to, after having eaten lunch, you'd go back, and I'd try to get there early so I could go visit with the baby Jesus.
Wow.
Let there be good witches, because I'm one. And the only images that I had of witches had to do with Halloween. And I didn't know why, but I just, like, knew that I was a witch. You know, and that was very difficult because, you know, Catholic Church is not, it's not very receptive. There was nobody to talk about that with. There was nobody to discuss, you know, doing ritual, or how you did ritual, or how you came into your power, or, you know, so there was me and my little magic marble.
So then you met Barbara. Was Barbara Deming the first person at the camp?
No, by then I knew that there were other witches
Uh-huh.
at the camp, and it just really flowed for me. You know, I had no problem doing ritual, although I think that there was a little period where the first maybe witches circle that I was going to go to was similar to that first circle that I was going to go to when I first got there. Well, if it doesn't feel right, you can always back away, you know, leave, get out, whatever. Only to find that, you know, all the parts of me that were hungry to I don't know that I had ever chanted or done it, but you know what, all of that stuff just absolutely came, it just came natural. The first time I keened, I was the one who suggested keening. I had never keened in my life. And the only way I knew that was, you know, from books. Like, but what happened to me when I started to do it was just this enormous amount of emotion that I felt, you know, went all the way back to the burning of the witches. I mean, it was just, the sounds that came out of us were just unbelievable.
And this keening took place where?
The first time, I had never heard of an affinity group till I went to the peace camp. But I'm sure that within a few days, I was going on this action. And the idea was that some of the women were going to go into the depot. And I had the list of the women and the names of their support people to call, and whose cat needed to be watered, and plant needed to be watered, and cats that needed to be fed, right? However, before we could get too far underway, some local sheriff pulled his vehicle in behind ours so that we could no longer get out. And so he wanted to know what we were doing there. And so we had a candle going. And the candle, yeah, talk about witches. So he said, "What are you doing here?" And somebody said, "Well, it's full moon or and we're having a witches gathering." And he said, "Oh, witches gathering, ha 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 ha."
Huh.
And then he blew the candle out, all right? And the woman was holding the candle, and we're all like staring at the candle, and it lit up again. And he stepped back, and then he blew it out again. The candle lit up again. So it was. Oh, I think my gown is.
You can use your other hand. I was just realizing you can't use your other hand. You can get rid of that gown, baby. We have visual.
Oh, please.
If you want to.
You encased me in a drapery.
I saw you trying to use your other hand with the candle. It was like we were.
Anyhow, so we found ourselves stuck, all right, unable to get away from there. The women hadn't completed the action. The tools got tossed, and the next thing we knew, the military was on us they rolled in these big lights, and I think there were at least 13 of us, which I remember Garden being one of them, Murph being another one. And Murph had in her pocket a bunch of Girl Scout badges. Now, it was real scary because these guys came, they were inside the fence and they were outside the fence. They had come down 96 and were behind us.
These are military people?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they had guns. I mean,
Oh.
they jumped off the truck with guns. It was
Was this at the, what gate was this?
This was on the back side. It wasn't at a gate, it was at a corner. And so we needed to burn the list. So we had the I can't remember, but I remember that as the guys were coming towards us, it was like, let's keen. And then we started, and those guys stopped dead in their tracks. And that the noise was just so horrific of the wailing and crying and feeling like for everybody you've ever lost or who's ever died or in a war, and just thinking of women over the eons who have had to put up with guns and I just remember like just letting that come. So eventually, and we keened for a good while, and those guys, they would not come within, I mean, they were like 15 feet away. They weren't coming any closer. And that as that happened and we saw that they were like, kind of, it was kind of like a bit of somewhat of a standoff. I mean, we were stuck in the position we were in. We felt we were all going to get arrested. But we started to do this little ritual of we needed to burn things and get rid of some things. And so we would lean back and go, just reaching, pull a piece of wood. I mean, because there was not a whole lot around us. And so you had to like find something that would burn so that we could burn the list and rip it up and stuff. And then inside, they were searching, I'm sure, for a quarter of a mile or half a mile down, looking for where we had maybe dug or gone under, or were there any evidence of us having been in, you know, so that they were inside the fence, they were searching all of that. And outside, they were just kind of holding us. And so eventually we got a little bit more bold, and okay, so now we're going to do standing. And I remember Garden and I getting up, and she always had these great scarves, and each of us on one end of the scarf dancing, you know, doing some things. But by now we all had, it seems to me that Merv had like these 12 Girl Scout badges, and that was, I mean, we sang songs and we did this whole ritual, you know, and we thought it was the funniest thing that we were getting Girl Scout badges for doing this non-action action, you know. It was just very funny. But it was my first action, and I think I was, I mean, I had been petrified initially, but, and then we saw the white deer on the way home, and it rained as soon as they finally all left, and, you know, that was it.
Well, I think there's about a minute left.
On this tape.
On this tape.
Okay, so then I can say, I just absolutely love the women. If it wasn't for the women, we would not be singing.
We would not be joyful, living, loving and beloved women.
If it wasn't for the women,
we would not be
living, loving, we would not be joyful,
singing, loving and beloved